All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. While we wait for more attendees to join, feel free to put your name and your state or organization in the chat. This is a webinar format on Zoom, but we're trying to make it very interactive today. So feel free to post things in the chat or in the Q&A throughout. And we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, so welcome everyone. As a heads up, we are going to be recording this webinar and posting it on NASEO's website afterwards. We also will share the slides with registered attendees afterwards. And first, I just wanted to start off with an overview of resources and engagement opportunities that are available to state energy offices that are interested in low to moderate income community solar. And then our main presentation is of the LIFT Solar Toolkit. So we'll have Dr. Elvis Maleka and Sarah Orr from Groundswell, and they're going to share all of the different tools available to you all and additional resources and papers that they've put out. And we will reserve the last 15 minutes for discussion. So feel free to raise your hand with the Zoom function and unmute, or you can also add questions throughout the presentation using the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And for those of you just joining, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat with your name and state or agency. And with that, I'll just provide a little bit of an overview of the Inclusive Shared Solar Initiative. This initiative is a multi-state partnership that engages with stakeholders in state government, low-income communities, with solar developers and financial institutions, with the goal of expanding and replicating the NYSERDA Solar for All model to expand access to community solar. And this effort is coordinated by NASEO and the National Energy Assistance Directors Association, with funding from DOE CETO, as well as support from our expert advisory group. And we also have great state partners. Our state implementation partners are Wisconsin, Minnesota, and DC. And these partners are working on implementing pilot projects. They put out some excellent state implementation plans earlier in the summer, and they attend our regular check-ins and share their findings and updates with the wider ISSI group. And then we also have observer states who also attend the meetings and hear from the experts that we bring in and learn from their peers in other states. So if you're interested in joining this initiative, please email Sandy Fazeli or myself, and we're happy to answer any questions or help you sign up if you're interested. And then another opportunity we wanted to make sure that you're aware of is the National Community Solar Partnership and the States Collaborative. So NCSP is a coalition of community solar stakeholders that's led by DOE, NREL, and Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. And their goal is to expand access to community solar to 5 million households or the equivalent, and decrease energy bill savings or decrease energy bills by $1 billion by 2025. And in doing so, they're really trying to expand access to these meaningful benefits of community solar. So including reduced energy burden, increased resilience, community ownership, and equitable workforce development. And so the States Collaborative is a part of this partnership, and it's really focused on bringing together a group of states and stakeholders to access free technical assistance, again, have that peer learning network and hear from experts, and then also access all of the resources and events and action planning guidance provided by DOE and the national labs. So if you're interested in joining the National Community Solar Partnership, you can sign up through the Mobilize platform linked in this slide, which we will share afterwards. And if you're interested in joining the States Collaborative specifically, you can email community.solar@ee.doe.gov. And feel free to add any questions about these two opportunities in the chat or the Q&A, and we'd be happy to answer those. So with that, I do want to pass it over to Sarah with Groundswell to present on the LIFT Solar Toolkit.
Thank you, Grace. I'm actually going to hand this over to Elvis. He's going to share our slides.
Awesome.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much, Grace and Sarah. And once again, good afternoon, everyone. So very quickly, can we please go to the next slide? So in a couple of minutes, Sarah and I are going to show a live demo of the LIFT Toolkit. LIFT stands for Low Income Financing and Transaction Model. It's a 3-year funded research by the Department of Energy, with Groundswell being the lead of that project in collaboration with Southface Institute, Elevate, and Clean Energy Works. So in June of this year, we published 3 groundbreaking research papers or articles. They are all listed on the LIFT website. And we just want to share a high-level overview of each of these articles. But in terms of numbers, quantitatively, the LIFT Toolkit itself is built on 453 projects across 18 states. So we'll talk more about how we came about designing some of the functionalities of the LIFT Toolkit. Can we please go to the next slide? So out of the 3 publications, the first was to really understand customer experience. So the goal of the LIFT Toolkit or the LIFT Solar Everywhere research is to examine the financial performance as well as customer experience of programs and projects that specifically serve LMI households. So the first of the 3 reports was an examination of the customer experience. And one of the things that we find in terms of what motivates subscribers of community solar is just the environment, helping the environment, going green, as well as saving. So saving money. And hopefully in the course of this presentation today, we'll discuss about LMI savings and why that is important. But what we found in this analysis is not just savings, but how savings are communicated to customers really matter. Because most of the questions that we see in the industry is that subscribers don't really know. For example, bill savings, like what is my savings? How much money am I saving per month or on aggregate since I enroll for maybe a particular community solar program? And another thing that we found is that for programs that charge premiums to subscribers, they are not willing. So we saw very low level of customer satisfaction. And there was also a direct correlation between customer satisfaction and projects that perform better financially. And conclusively from that customer experience report is that formal relationships are really important. And this is also based on a targeted approach, how we engage with community-based organizations and developing partnerships to be able to ensure that we are actually meeting the needs of communities that really deserve some of the services that we provide. For the growth of community solar projects, I think is very striking and unique feature about the LIFT report is that out of the total installations in the United States, only less than 5% can be attributed to LMI household too. So, and I think that was like the motivation that how do we design a toolkit that really propels the development of community solar projects across the entire state. So we also realized from that growth of community solar across the country, this is not specific to one project or a couple of projects, but we'll examine the entirety, is that community solar is one of the fastest growing segments in the industry right now. And so we also found that it's not just a growing industry, but it's also used as a vehicle of sustainability. And we also realized that states that have enabling legislation tended to have high customer experience in terms of satisfaction, and that satisfaction doubled compared to states that did not have enabling legislation. We'll see some of the demonstration and what that means in the toolkit itself. Then lastly, from the growth of community solar report, we also realized the relationship between customer experience and high rates and states that have provide incentive, be it tax incentives or other utility incentives. Next slide, please. And lastly, we also had the third paper was the analysis of the LIFT research. So in this analysis, the first thing that we did was we did two types of analysis in one. So we spoke to program administrators, about 21 of them who were able to send us their financial performance. So they sent us their pro forma data, which we were very grateful because during the peak of the pandemic, it was really difficult to have data, talk less of submitting financial performance of a given project. So first of all, one of the things we saw was the LMI inclusion rate, that it varies from projects, but on average, each of the projects that we sample serve LMI household. And there was also a great correlation between the value stack and the performance of the project, be it from high levels of savings. But what we found was we wanted to be able to understand what are some of the barriers. And from a developer perspective or from a financier perspective, or whether one is a developer and a financier. So we saw that portfolio size is usually one of the things that developers usually bring to play, risk mitigation as well, as well as post-site negotiation. But more generally, the time that is needed to structure and execute deals. And this is just typical across the industry, from zoning, from contracting, and negotiation, and just making sure that all the policy and legal documents are ready. Now, the conclusion from this paper report, which we found, is that out of the sample that we study, is that I know the element prior to this research, we had a lot of conversation about the risk scheme. But we found that community solar projects are financed the same way. It's the same mechanism. So for the couple of projects that we examined, there were really no aspect about whether it's investing in community solar or LMI community solar is high risk. And this is because the program administrators that share data with us, most of them remove requirements like FICO score. So, and they made the process really easy for LMI community, for LMI household to subscribe to some of these programs. So all these reports are on the LIFT website, as I mentioned. And at this point, I will hand it over to Sarah or to walk us through the demo of the toolkit.
Thanks, Elvis. And I will just get my screen up. All right. So our toolkit, as Elvis mentioned, is really based around this data set of 453 community solar projects across 18 states. And just to give you a very high-level overview of how we've organized the resources, we have defined the user journey through an explore page to really explore the data set and the data points that we've captured, through the design page, which we're going to spend most of our time on today. Elvis is going to talk us through that. And then we also just have an additional learn page where you can dive into some of the reports that Elvis mentioned, as well as all of the case studies on our website. So getting started, I'm going to just briefly show you the aspects that we capture in our data set. So when we click on the Explore page, we are brought to this landing page with a map integrated with GIS software. And we have color-coded the projects by utility type. So each of these pins represents one of our projects in our data set, and our cooperative utility, IOU, or municipal owned utility. And so you can manipulate this data set in a couple different ways, engage with it. And so you can zoom in or out. And as you'll see, this project list below will automatically update. And I'll show you this table in just a second. But first, let's click on one of these pins. So this will bring up our project summary page, and each of our projects has a project summary page. And this will provide the first view at what our data set truly captures. And so there are 16 data fields in our database for each of the projects. And the way that we've derived which data points we wanted to capture, we really did take this consumer-centered approach at making sure we were capturing the LMI share of capacity, how the LMI requirement for participation in the project, if there are minimum savings mandated, and then we've captured a percentage of the average customer savings for each project. And so by clicking through these projects, you can kind of begin to compare and contrast the impact of the regulatory framework or enabling legislation in the states to kind of see which of these attributes drive these customer savings or inclusion metrics. We will talk about case studies in just a second, but depending on the project summary page, some of them have our case studies mapped to them as well for various characteristics within them that map to these attributes for this project. And I'll let Elvis share more about that on the design feature. Going back to the Explore page, let's click through. I just want to show you another way to manipulate this information. So over here, you'll see our attributes. And so these are ways of sorting the data set that we have. So sorting those 16 fields. And we created little definitions for each of them. So we want this to be a very user-friendly tool, regardless of your level of familiarity with community solar projects. So say you are a cooperative utility and you're going to have a relatively small system size and you want to see which projects exist that fit these criteria that deliver the highest level of customer savings. So you're going to click Apply Filters, and then you'll see both our map as well as our database below automatically updates to show 7 projects in 3 states. Now what this table is below is directly pulling from our data set. We only capture 10 fields here just because we were limited by space on the page. So we wanted to get the most important metrics up front and center. But say you want to sort through these projects based on which of these projects that deliver this high level of savings deliver it to the most customers. And so you can go ahead and click on the column header and you'll be able to click through the projects in that order. And so that's just a very brief overview of what the Explore function can do. I do just want to mention that at any point you can download the results of what you've derived based on the map or attributes. And you can also at any point download the entire data set with all 16 data fields for all 453 projects. So now I'm going to hand it over to Elvis to talk us through how we can leverage some of the data points to deliver really tailored learnings.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Before looking at a couple of scenarios here, I just want to say, I mentioned at the beginning that community solar is one of the fastest growing segments of the industry right now. So there are 3 main goals of the design function of the LIFT toolkit. So the first is that it serves as a pre-development tool. And by that, we really hope that this toolkit is going to encourage developers to go ahead and start developing community solar, irrespective of what states they are. And the second thing is that the design function has a lot of different financing models that the developer can use. For example, in this case, be it case studies or different financing models or mixes that really matches their criteria. And the third part of it is that it's also an optimization tool. Sarah did just showed us, for example, an example of a curve, and she selected a system size. What if after maybe putting the search criteria in and the developer sees things like, okay, what if I change my my input a little bit, I vary my input, what results am I going to get in terms of the output? So that optimality criteria is really important, especially in the environment we find ourselves. So in terms of the output, as we see, the first thing is that when the user selects a state, there are 4 outputs, potential outputs that are going to come up. So the first is we're going to see 1 to 3 projects that are similar to the states that the user entered. And I'm going to explain what we mean by similar projects very soon. We're also going to see a couple of case studies, between 1 to 4 case studies that are similar. Then we're going to have a set of best practices that kind of matches the input field that the user selected. And in some cases, depending on what state we select, then we're going to see related resources. Now, we also know that with the passing of the Inflation Reduction Act and the regulatory environment, is going to play a big role as far as development of community solar is concerned, and the solar industry, broadly speaking. So we're going to use two scenarios here. The first, we're going to select a state where there is enabling legislation, and we'll select a state where we don't have enabling legislation to see how that works. So I'm excited. So let's go ahead and select a state. Okay, so thank you so much for that, Sarah. So we have selected Vermont, for example, in this case, and we see that first of all, I want to say the main difference between the drivers in the explore function and the design function is that in the explore function, we have definitions. As Sarah did mention, full transparency to ensure that whether you're using the toolkit for the first time or not, you should be able to understand how to navigate it too. But in the design function, one of the things that we really wanted to capture is the impact of the drivers on the financial performance of the model. And I know I mentioned about LMI customer savings. So we know, for example, that savings actually is a direct impact. It's a direct driver and has a direct impact on the financial performance of a given project. So looking at our case at Vermont, for example, we see that it's auto-populated. The bill credit value is there. I'm going to talk a little bit about that if time permits, or hopefully in the QA section. Now, let's also go and select, are you a taxable entity? The user can just click on the default and fetch best practices, but we don't want to have too many different scenarios. And since I mentioned about LMI customer savings, we're going to select high LMI customer savings. And with that, let's go ahead and click fetch best practices. Now, these are the drivers. We see the attributes that Sarah did mention. And we also see a couple of similar projects. Now, this is really important that now this particular user is in Vermont, for example, but now there are a couple of case studies, similar projects that show up in Vermont, but we also have a couple of, we also have an example of a project in New Hampshire. And this is really important because when we talk of similar projects, we're saying that the case study, the algorithm is in such a way that it pulls out projects that are similar to the preset of that particular state. It can be any other state. It's like telling you that, hey, I know you selected Vermont, for example, but based on the inputs that you've entered, there are a couple of other projects in other states that you can leverage and learn from these projects. So this is a really cool aspect about the design function. And the second output that I want to share is case studies. Now, this is really super important. Sarah will talk us through the case studies, go through the different types that we have for each of our utility types. But now we see that this user is in Vermont, for example. A couple of case studies show up, and we've color-coded the case studies as well. Sarah will talk us more about this, that the user now can really click on a case study that really matches the preset for Vermont in this case and say, hey, there are projects, an example of successful by case studies. We're talking of examples of successful projects. Incorporate being example of successful projects that have different financial mechanisms. But I don't want to talk, I'm a bit tempted to talk about a case study, but I just realized Sarah will talk us through that. Now let's go to the best practices now. So not only is the user presented with similar project case studies, but they are presented with best practices. So for example, we also included a rationale why certain best practices show up. So for example, in this case, we didn't select, they're in a state with the value stack is low. So an example of a best practice that show up is like, hey, you can take advantage of new market tax credits, for example. Or because you are in a state with low rates, for example, you can take advantage of state and municipal bonds. And because you selected, you are a taxable entity, you can also take advantage of the investment tax credit, for example, as well as asset depreciation. And again, for other states, like some states do provide utility incentives. So these are some of the best practices that can show up. Now, and I also want to share that based on this state we selected, in this case, we selected Vermont, now we see related resources. So one of the things that is really important, again, in this section of the toolkit is that unlike other tools, the way the LIFT Toolkit is designed is that the resources are kind of mapped. So the user now have a good user experience. So be it a developer, it's like, hey, I don't need to go anywhere to look for resources. The toolkit pulls resources that are relevant to my search criteria. So how wonderful that is. And so now with that being said, let's look at another example. So we're going to go ahead and Sarah is going to, we're going to clear filter. Now, in this case, let's look at a state for which we know there are no enabling legislation. Okay, so Wisconsin showed up. Okay, now one thing I want to say here is that this is really super important. When designing this toolkit, we thought of the solar landscape in the next 20 years. And I know that it seems a little bit too ambitious, but as we will see later, it doesn't matter what state you are. The toolkit is useful for developers to start designing projects and programs that serve LMI household. Now, I want to stress that by no enabling legislation, we saw that for this particular state, customer experience is low, financial performance tended to be low as well. Now, what it means is that I know New Mexico just passed a request for proposal, but what this implies is that for states that currently don't have enabling legislation, it just implies community solar is kind of difficult to develop. Like the only mechanism is directly through the utilities, as we can see that Wisconsin is a regulated market compared to other states like DC, for example, which is a deregulated market, but all through a pilot program. Now, we're still going to use, for example, this is a developer in Wisconsin. Now, although community solar has not been legislated, for example, but let's see what they can do. Let's assuming that I'm a developer and I say, okay, with the passing of the Inflation Reduction Act, I want to be able to take advantage of maybe being a taxable entity. I will say yes. And because I know the importance of savings as well, I'm going to select LMI customer savings equals to high. It can be anything. And I hit on fetch best practices. Now, what we see is that, again, we see the attributes, which are the presets. Now, this is a developer in Wisconsin. And what the toolkit produces is that, hey, based on the preset for Wisconsin, we now see similar projects, a couple of projects in Florida, for example, that you can start taking advantage of this project. Click on the particular project, can be in Florida, that the toolkit has selected based on the preset for Wisconsin, and now inform your learning about developing a community solar project. Now, we also see, for example, case studies here. This is really super important because one of the things, as Sarah will show us, is how can I take advantage of different financing mechanisms to be able to build my community solar project. I am in Wisconsin. I have no idea about any successful project across the country, but it's pulling out projects here and telling us, hey, these projects are also segmented based on the utility type that we want to see. And as I mentioned previously, we also have best practices that show up in this particular example. So before handing it over to Sarah, I want to say maintaining this toolkit is our top priority. We want to be able to ensure that at least every state in the United States is represented here. So, but we'll come to that later. I will hand it over to Sarah to walk us through the learn function of the toolkit.
Thanks, Elvis. So yeah, as I mentioned before, we have on our Learn page, we've organized it into LIFT resources as well as the external resources that we've mapped. But what I want to spend time on now is talking through some of our case studies. And so as you saw, the case studies came up through the results, either through the explore function or the design function, but we wanted to make sure there was just a library in one place for folks to click through. And so what our case studies are is we took our project list of 453 projects and we identified over 30 case studies, potential projects that based on their financing mechanisms, we thought would be interesting to take a deep dive into. And so these were kind of our initial list of best practices, our finance best practices. And these were built out of our research on the finance report as well as the customer experience report. And so from that list, we derived our potential case studies. And then we were able to end up completing 23 case studies out of that pool. So the toolkit has a total number of 23 case studies from different states. And then from this research, we added best practices to our best practice list. And so where we recognize maybe a common theme coming up, another innovative way of financing these projects, we added that to our best practice list, which is the best practices that Elvis just talked about on the design function. And for each case study, we worked closely with the program developers or program owners to verify our research that we'd conducted, and then went through a formal approval process before publishing these. I just want to spend a little time on a couple case studies today. So we pulled up 3 here. As Elvis mentioned, these are also color coded based on utility type, matching those color coding on our map. And so this is the first one that I wanted to just talk about today is the Orlando Utilities Commission in Florida. It is a municipal owned utility. And up here we have our best practices. So we wanted to list them kind of up front and center for folks to easily identify. And then we also have just a brief project summary here. You can go to the website. You see the system size as well as the number of LMI customers. And so this project was pretty interesting because this was a partnership between the municipal utility as well as the city of Orlando and it's called the Hope Church. And so we see a really tight partnership between city, state, and city, state, and church. And through this partnership, they were able to rehabilitate 58 vacant units into sustainable, affordable housing that had rooftop solar of a 52.2 kilowatt AC installation. And each of these units was individually connected to was individually net metered. And so they were able to immediately see savings on their bill credits. The project was financed through the OUC, the utility had approximately 60,000 saved up in a balance of energy efficiency rebates. And so they were able to use this money that they'd saved up with, and the city of Orlando matched that dollar for dollar to develop this project. And what we see is at the end of the project, I also wanted to spend some time on the lessons learned. Then this is kind of a common theme throughout some of our case studies is the ownership is a little bit difficult to nail down depending on where the site was, the installation was sited. And so in this case, the Hope Church owned the installation, but through the partnership of working with the utility and the fact that the tenants were individually metered, but they did not own their properties. In this case, they were not, OUC was a nonprofit, so they are not able to take advantage of the tax credit. But again, we see the energy efficiency rebate program and the ability to put those towards this project and with the matching of the city. And then I also wanted to, this is another theme throughout, strong community partnerships are key to the success of a lot of these projects. And we mean that in multiple ways, not only in the financing side, in that seeing this strong tie between the city, church, and municipality was what enabled this project to be to get off the ground, but also we'll see in some of the other case studies, community partnership really driving this customer buy-in and kind of validating the project for customers who maybe think this is too good to be true. So those were just a bit of the highlights I wanted to share on that case study. Now we have the Coyote Ridge Solar Farm. So this is a cooperative utility owned. And the best practices here, this actually also was a nonprofit, but they were able to take advantage of the tax through a lease back with CoBank. And so what they did here was they explored many different potential financing options and decided to go with this leasing structure with CoBank. And so they were able to take advantage of the ITC. And then they were also matched with a grant from the Colorado Energy Office. And so again, we see this mix of complex financing, but the buy-in from multiple partners. And so the other partners in this case study I mentioned, the co-op, they are Poudre Valley Rural Electric Association, the Colorado Energy Office, and then Grid Alternatives, who provided some of the workforce development and installation support. And then some unique characteristics about this one, even further, it was developed through a volunteer workforce development model. And so there was 300 volunteers who spent nearly 3,200 hours building the array. The site was on an active landfill, and so they were able to rehabilitate the space and use the space for this large array. And then this project also split the costs between income qualified and general service subscribers, as well as nonprofit businesses. And so the general service subscribers, as well as the nonprofit businesses, were able to subscribe to the project through an upfront fee, as well as monthly subscription fee. But through this financing mechanism, they were able to offer the remaining portion of the production to low-income households at no cost. And so those households immediately saw 30% savings on their energy costs. And then the final project that I wanted to highlight is the Kearsarge Johnstown project, which is in New York. And this is an IOU, investment owned utility. And so the best practices in this case study were they were able to sell and leverage the renewable energy credits, as well as, again, state and federal grants. And so the projects in this, the partners in this project were Kearsarge Energy, the IOU, NYSERDA through the Solar for All program, Common Energy as the developer. And so through the NYSERDA Solar for All program, 20%, there's a mandate of 20% of the subscriber base to LMI subscribers, and a mandated minimum of 10% savings. And so this project, I just wanted to highlight another innovative approach to this. They actually shared the land, and I'll show this picture, with a farm. And so they are able to have a multi-use of the array site with farm grazing. And they also were able to offer the no-cost subscriptions. One lesson learned, which kind of speaks to some additional findings in the customer experience report, was the qualification process was a little bit challenging to understand and time-consuming for subscribers. And so this just speaks to the overall finding that we found in the customer experience report of trying to decomplicate some of these very complex procedures and getting folks enrolled in the program, but then as well describing bill savings. And so just to wrap us up here, to highlight a couple of these common themes that we saw across these case studies. I already kind of touched on them, but these are really a great place to go and take a deep dive into some of these very successful projects. And they range from 10,000 subscribers to 50. So there's a really wide range in learnings you can glean from these. But yeah, just to reiterate, strong community partnerships to support this complex financing, as well as supporting customer buy-in. Leveraging existing subscription pools was something we saw across a lot of the case studies. So leveraging the LIHEAP program or energy efficiency or existing weatherization programs, for example, to identify potential subscribers for the community solar project. Local government buy-in, And that's where this group is so important. And then just that ownership piece can be kind of complex depending on where we are citing the installation. So with that being said, I will stop sharing my screen and hand it back over to Grace.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Sarah. And thanks everyone for tuning in. As I mentioned, feel free to start putting your questions in the chat. I apologize, or sorry, in the Q&A function. I apologize that the chat was not enabled for this. But please put your questions in the Q&A, or feel free to just raise your hand and we can allow you to unmute and ask your question that way. But thank you so much, Sarah and Elvis, for your great presentations and demo. This was really helpful to me, and I certainly learned a lot, and I think this will be a great tool for states to facilitate peer learning and really develop the best programs. And I see Sandy has a question, so go ahead.
Great. Yes, just echoing Grace, thank you both for the presentation and for this amazing information. I'm curious if you have any suggestions for states as they navigate community solar programs about sort of data collection practices. Are there specific metrics or sort of requirements that you think a community solar program should absolutely have, and especially recognizing that, you know, it's an evolving market? You know, what's the best way to sort of help it fit into a data set like this so that we can have this compare and contrast moving forward?
Okay, I can go ahead and answer that, Cindy. Thank you so much. I think that's a really great question. First of all, the regulatory environment, as I said, is going to play a very big role. And so the first thing is that the mandates are going to be slightly different from states to states, you know, the requirements. So one of the things I think that is really important, and why this toolkit serves as that benchmark for the industry, is, first of all, from a data perspective, there are so many data points. But I think first thing for every state, once the mandate has been made very clear, is that minimum carve out. You know, so it's important that the states specify, for example, for every community solar project that is developed, let's say a certain percentage needs to be attributed to LMI household, and that is what we did in our database. So for New Mexico, for example, it's 30%, and that is really huge. Yeah, I'm super excited about that. And I think the other thing that really needs to be made very clear now is, for example, once the carve out, and like kind of setting that eligibility criteria, that framework is really super important. Now, there are other data points that can be collected as we did share from the toolkit, but for states in particular, I think it's really important to be able to share that incentive package. So for example, we know that utilities do have their own incentives, and states and local governments also have other incentives. Now, I want to say in terms of performance, so now let's have this two scenario. Let me be a little bit biased because I live in Virginia. I'm in Virginia, for example, and someone else is in, let's say, Kentucky, for example. Now, if the incentives in Virginia, for example, now, although, let's say, I'm assuming that these two states, right? But on paper, they are not. Kentucky does not currently have enabling legislation. But let me just assume that they do have enabling legislation. But if the incentives are different, then we see that in terms of performance and customer satisfaction, we might have more projects that perform better in Virginia, for example. So I think we have to look at this, especially state regulators, needs to examine this from a very holistic perspective, not only setting the basic framework that needs to happen, but also checking the performances as well. So that includes, as Sarah did mention, working in collaboration with other organizations, to be able to ensure that these programs are actually performing. And the main reason I'm saying this is because when we started our data collection process, there were a couple of projects that we felt are serving LMI household, but when we got into it, they were not. And so that was shocking to us because on paper, I don't know if some of these programs receive funding that they serve LMI household, but they don't. So I think there's a lot that we need to do. I don't know if that answers your question, Cindy.
Really helpful. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks. On a similar note, I had a question about one metric in particular, the LMI customer savings. I know a lot of different programs in different states calculate that in different ways. So I'm curious how that works with the platform and how you calculated that.
Okay, that's also another very great question. Thank you so much, Chris, for that. So we indirectly capture LMI savings in terms of, not in terms of the actual percentage, but the framework we use is that we took the difference between the community solar rate and minus, like subtracted that from the utility rate divided by the utility rate as a fraction. But let me answer your question in a way that is, let me add a little perspective to that. So yes, it is true that savings is usually one of the most complicated aspects when it comes to LMI communities solar. And I want to say that many factors that determines savings, the degree to the level of savings. So the bill credit is one of them, as well as the subscriber model being used. And this is really crucial. Now, let's take, for example, for a certain community solar project. Let's say if the community solar rate, let's say, for example, is 6 cents per kilowatt hour. And for a subscriber to be able to save, they must pay less than 6. It just makes sense, less than 6 cents, right? Now, if the mechanism is on, let's say, the full rate or the retail rate. So let's say if the retail rate is, for example, let's say 12 cents. Now, the subscriber can still pay more than, for example, 6 cents to be able to save more. So what am I saying? So the first thing we say, there are other factors that determine the bill savings. So for example, energy rates are indirectly related to savings, but savings are directly related to the type of subscriber model being used. And this is really important. And how we communicate it also matters. So for example, let's say I give the example, if the main reason why customers or subscribers have confusion or questions about their bill, because we have to do better, both the utilities and providers of community solar, to explain this. And there's also a learning aspect. This is because for a particular community solar project where the community solar rate is like 6 cents, as said, now if the subscriber pays, for example, let's say 5 cents, so they are just saving a cent, right? So they might see savings, but their savings is very low. Whereas if we went in for a full retail rate, which is, let's say, 12 cents, and the subscriber is paying, let's say, 6 cents, although a subscriber pays more, let's say they are paying 8 cents, for example, and the full retail rate is 12 cents, they might see higher savings. So this is why savings is really complicated, because it depends on a lot of factors. Energy rates is just one of them. Interconnection cost is also one of them. But the financing mechanism is really super important. And as an industry, we need to communicate that better. And that is why how the LIFT Toolkit serves that purpose as well. I don't know, Grace, did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. And thanks for providing that context as well. That's super helpful. Again, feel free to unmute or raise your hand or add questions to the Q&A, but I do have a few more since we have time. I think one of you mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act and the additional incentives coming through, and I'm curious how you see that impacting the toolkit, whether it's additional filters on the map or just more and more projects coming on. What does that process look like for keeping the map updated?
Yeah, thanks, Grace. I can take that one. So we are in the process of finalizing our SOPs to keep the toolkit updated. It is, I think Elvis mentioned this, but it's absolutely of our utmost importance to keep this up to date. And that entails several aspects. So, we want to make sure that the data set that we currently have, the project list, as well as the regulatory structures and each state's regulatory framework is up to date. And then we also, of course, want to just maintain the site itself, and adding additional filters is something that we are, whether it's project attributes or whether it's certain data points that we want to capture. We have another kind of realm of maintenance that has to do with that R&D piece. And we also, I'll also just share before, see if Elvis has anything specifically to add about the IRA, but we went through a user acceptability phase back in October. So before this was released publicly, we did gather feedback from key stakeholder groups and jotted down some really, really great ideas from that phase about expanding. Have you thought about adding, a metric to identify community ownership of projects? And so that is, we already have a running list of R&D things that we want to look into, and definitely want to just continue building this out as a robust resource for not only community solar projects, but how does that interact with resiliency? How does that interact with specific financing opportunities, funding opportunities that are coming down? So yeah, absolutely. And we're thinking through that right now.
Awesome. That's great to hear. I'm sure it's a lot to keep track of, but glad that you have the forum to do so. And it sounds like there's been a lot of stakeholder input. So one other question I had is, this tool seems like, especially the design piece of it, any solar developer could go on and adjust certain metrics or figure out how to best optimize their future project. But I'm curious how other stakeholders, such as state energy offices, can use this tool, whether it's to advise developers or work on policy and program design, whether they're just starting off or expanding or changing their program, or just learning from peers. I'm curious if you've had conversations with states, or if you see a role for state energy offices specifically in using and deploying this tool.
I'll go off the mute button there. Thank you again, Grace, for that. So yeah, it's a very important question, and we've been having a series of discussions, especially with the DOE. But the way I see this is, first of all, this toolkit, actually, we just spoke to someone from the DOE today and said, this toolkit is unique because you don't often see tools in their first iteration like this. This to me seems like version 8. And that's because it kind of captures the narrative in the industry right now and what the demands and the needs are right now. Now, the challenge for state offices or regulators is that now they work with the local government, right? And so, for example, for them, it's really difficult to be able to find out or to know exactly which organizations, be it frontline organizations, can really go ahead and start enacting some of the implementation and policy changes. So they come up with a big picture, for example, the LIFT tool that we're talking about. And so it's just like that big picture. But for an organization like Groundswell and this toolkit is that we kind of, based on the research that we've done here at Groundswell as well, so we kind of saw that big picture already and decided to design a tool that kind of meet this narrative. So I would say for state energy offices, the first thing is, as Sarah did mention about being able to channel resources. I think that is one of the biggest challenges right now, to be able to know which organizations in particular can be different types of categories of organizations, whether they are value-aligned organizations, but to be able to say, for example, like Groundswell has produced this toolkit, for example, how can we leverage the expertise that they have, be it from a technical assistantship perspective now. So for example, one of the ways is like for a state energy office can say, hey, maybe I want this particular organization, can be anywhere, for example, to work with Groundswell to be able to enhance this aspect. Now, technical assistantship can also come in as a result of development. As I said, it's a pre-development tool. And so we were very happy to have been involved in, for example, the Community Power Accelerator, that we led that particular design of the courses. So the technical assistantship is, let's say a developer wants to start. I don't have any idea. Can I find an organization who can talk us through some of these, maybe a design framework that really works and really helped me and guides me how to go about designing this. So I think the real challenge is to be able to look for those type of organizations like Groundswell. I know we stand in a position where not only from the work that we do from our subscriber management team, but also from the data science team where Sarah and I are heavily involved, as well as the research aspect. And again, there's also an advocacy aspect and partnership that other teams within Groundswell do. So I think there's a lot. And above everything, we need to work very collaboratively right now.
Definitely. Thank you, Elvis. And perhaps one final question for you all. I think it's come up a few times, but I'm curious, beyond customer savings, how do you define sort of a successful community solar project in terms of what you've highlighted through the case studies and the best practices? What goes into that? And is it just customer savings, or does it also factor in some of the customer experience side of things that you mentioned in that first report?
Yeah, so first I would just direct anyone who's interested in exploring the toolkit to go to our About page, because we kind of outlined some of our inclusion criteria there, which are to be considered in a part of this pool was had to deliver bill savings through net metering or other way, and then to be had to require LMI participation through an income eligibility or carve out or other mandate. And then we did set a threshold of 10% of the customer base had to be low to moderate income to be included in the database. And then how you kind of define that successful piece, though, that's kind of, I think, what pushed our projects from the data set into a case study potential, and for those, we really did take a look at these common barriers, and that, the case studies and the whole toolkit really are financing focused, but we did include some of those, customer experience metrics, such as how savings were communicated. And I think identifying what those best practices were, what those common challenges across case studies were potentially going to be, helped us really identify which ones we're going to take a deeper dive on. And we had a long vetting process. So of those 30, I think several people weighed in on which ones should be like a higher priority or not. But absolutely, it's kind of a moving metric. I think more importantly than saying this is successful, this is not, was to just illuminate some of those methods that people use to get around some of these barriers that a lot of program developers face. Anything you want to add, Elvis?
Yeah, no, just to add, I think we the customer savings, bill savings is important, but for the customer experience reports, we did survey actually. So the results that came out from that paper are actual surveys of programs that serve LMI household. So we actually surveyed the customer experiences of subscribers. So that is a unique aspect about what we did. And I think it's really important, not just from customer retention perspective, because right now a lot of organizations go about customer acquisition, but for us here at Groundswell and the LIFT work that we did, customer retention is important, and ensuring that the needs of subscribers of community solar are met is of primary importance to us, as in addition to acquisition. So yeah, so those were real numbers for people who are actually part of the program. So yeah, we did the customer experience.
Fantastic. That sounds like a great approach. And thank you for providing more framing on that, both of you. And thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your toolkit. I think it'll be a really useful tool for everyone on this call, hopefully, and I'm sure many others as they start building out community solar programs to help expand access to low and moderate income households. So thank you for your time, and thanks everyone for joining. And we will follow up with all the attendees to share the slides and links to these great tools. So thanks so much and have a great rest of your week and a great holiday. Bye, everyone.